President Trump calling Putin's latest deadly strikes on Ukraine, quote, disgusting.
What if I told you that the future of Ukraine wasn't decided in Kyiv, or even in Moscow, but in a quiet, unexpected corner of America, Alaska? Yes, you heard that right. In a meeting that stunned the world, Donald Trump sat face-to-face with Vladimir Putin on American soil. And behind those closed doors, a shocking proposal was put on the table. Ukraine would give up massive chunks of its territory in exchange for the faint promise of peace. Think about that for a moment. While missiles still rain down on Ukrainian cities, while civilians live in fear of drones and airstrikes, two of the world's most powerful men were casually discussing how to redraw the map of Europe, like pieces on a chessboard. And the most chilling part? Neither of them seemed willing to answer the one question the world is desperate to know. When will the killing of civilians finally stop? This wasn't just another diplomatic summit. This was theater, power, and raw geopolitics playing out in front of the cameras, while the truth remained hidden behind smirks, silence, and vague promises. And as details leak about Putin's demands, Trump's surprising agreement, and Zelensky's growing fears, one thing becomes clear. This could be the most controversial turning point in the entire Russia-Ukraine war. The world expected icy handshakes and stiff political smiles, but what unfolded in Alaska shocked even seasoned diplomats. Picture this: Vladimir Putin, the man accused of waging one of the deadliest wars in modern history, steps onto American soil, welcomed not with confrontation, but with cameras flashing, Trump by his side. The room was tense. Reporters, hungry for answers, hurled brutal questions across the hall. Will you agree to a ceasefire? Will you stop killing civilians? The kind of questions that could corner any leader. But instead of a straight answer, there was silence. Putin's face tightened, a frown carved across his expression, before he muttered two words that sent chills through the room. "Let's go." And just like that, the press was shoved out. No explanations, no reassurances. Just an eerie silence from the man whose decisions have cost thousands of lives. Think about that moment. A U.S. president and a Russian president standing side by side while the world demanded accountability, and both refusing to speak. For many watching, it wasn't just silence. It was a signal that something bigger, darker, and far more dangerous was happening behind closed doors. And here's where things get even more unsettling. What was said in private after those unanswered questions could reshape Ukraine's borders forever. Behind those closed doors in Alaska, the truth slowly leaked out, and it was more shocking than anyone expected. According to reports, Putin didn't come begging for peace. No, he came with demands. Ruthless, calculated demands. He proposed what many are now calling a land for peace deal. The idea? Ukraine would surrender huge parts of its eastern territories, Donetsk and Luhansk, lands that Russian forces have been clawing at for years but never fully taken. In return, Russia would freeze its military advances in the south, in places like Kherson and Zaporizhia. Think about that for a second. Putin was essentially saying, "Give me what I want, and maybe I'll stop, for now." It wasn't peace. It was blackmail dressed up as diplomacy. And shockingly, Trump didn't slam the table or walk out of the room. Reports say he listened. He even agreed in principle, calling Russia too powerful and telling Ukraine to make a deal. Because, in his words, Russia is very, very big, and they are not. For Ukrainians, this was nothing short of betrayal. Imagine your home, your land, your family's history being treated like a bargaining chip in someone else's negotiation. But for Putin, this was the perfect play. force Ukraine to bleed, then demand concessions at the exact moment the world is desperate for a ceasefire. And yet, even with this deal on the table, there was one chilling condition. Putin flat out refused to agree to a ceasefire until Ukraine accepted. For many observers, this was the most chilling part of the Alaska talks. Even with all his proposals on the table, Putin made one thing crystal clear. There would be no ceasefire. Not today. Not tomorrow. Not until Ukraine surrendered the territories he wanted. This wasn't negotiation. It was extortion. Ukraine was being forced to choose between giving up its land or watching its people continue to suffer under the relentless barrage of missiles and drones. Every day that passed meant more cities reduced to rubble, more families torn apart, and more innocent lives lost. And Putin knew it. By refusing to pause the fighting, he kept his most powerful weapon alive: fear. For President Zelensky, this was unacceptable. His nation had already endured unimaginable destruction, and yet the Russian president was still demanding more. More territory, more power, more control. And worst of all, there was no guarantee he would stop even if Ukraine surrendered. After all, if a man refuses to halt his attacks while negotiating, what makes anyone believe he'll honor a deal after it's signed? But here's the twist. While Ukraine begged for an immediate ceasefire, Trump appeared to side with Putin's logic. He argued that Ukraine should consider Putin's offer seriously because, in his words, Russia's army was too strong, and the war couldn't be won on the battlefield. This left allies in Europe stunned. Was Trump pressuring Ukraine to give in, or was he setting the stage for the biggest geopolitical gamble of his career? Either way, the message from Alaska was brutal. The bombs wouldn't stop falling until Kyiv gave Moscow exactly what it wanted.
Donald Trump has always called himself the ultimate dealmaker. But in Alaska, his approach didn't look like tough negotiation. It looked like concession. Instead of drawing hard lines with Putin, Trump echoed Moscow's strength and Ukraine's weakness. He even reminded everyone that he was the one who first sent Javelin missiles to Kyiv during his presidency, almost as if he was justifying why he now had the right to tell Ukraine to compromise. To Trump, it seemed simple. Russia was too big, its army too strong, and its soldiers too great. In his words, Ukraine needed to make a deal, or risk losing everything. But to many allies, this sounded less like wisdom and more like surrender. Imagine being Zelensky, hearing a former American president, the man who once armed your forces, now telling you to hand over your land because your enemy is just too powerful. And this wasn't just about Ukraine. European leaders, already wary of Trump's unpredictable foreign policy style, saw his stance as a red flag. Was Trump leaning dangerously close to legitimizing Putin's invasion? Was he willing to trade away the sovereignty of a US ally just to score a peace deal he could take credit for? Critics blasted Trump for treating one of the bloodiest conflicts of our time like a real estate negotiation. But for Trump, the optics were everything. He positioned himself as the only man capable of ending the war, a leader willing to say the things no one else would. The problem? His words suggested peace would come not through strength or justice, but through Ukraine giving up its lifeblood, its land. And while Trump painted himself as a bold peacemaker, Zelensky and Europe began to wonder. Was America about to abandon Ukraine in its darkest hour? For President Zelensky, the Alaska revelations were nothing short of a nightmare. He had traveled the world, begged for weapons, pleaded for solidarity, and now he was being told by Donald Trump, face to face, that his nation might need to give up land just to survive. To Zelensky, it wasn't a compromise. It was surrender disguised as diplomacy. And he wasn't alone. European capitals lit up with panic. In Paris, Berlin, and London, leaders scrambled for emergency calls, trying to understand what Trump had promised Putin, and what that would mean for the fragile Western alliance. France's presidency immediately called for a video summit with Britain and Germany, a desperate attempt to form what insiders described as a coalition of the willing to keep supporting Ukraine. But behind the polished statements, the anxiety was clear. If Trump was serious, the entire strategy of backing Kyiv might collapse overnight. Zelensky himself tried to keep a brave face. But privately, he expressed deep skepticism. How could anyone believe Putin's word? Russia had violated every agreement before, from ceasefires in Donbass to security assurances under the Budapest Memorandum. If Ukraine ceded territory now, what would stop Russia from demanding more tomorrow? And what about the civilians trapped in the occupied zones, already living under brutal repression? Would they simply be abandoned? Meanwhile, as plans formed for Zelensky to meet Trump in Washington, European leaders debated whether to join him. The symbolism mattered, a united front or a fractured alliance. But beneath the surface, one question kept surfacing in every European capital. Was the United States about to trade away Ukraine's sovereignty for a shaky promise of peace? The cracks in the alliance were growing. And the silence from Alaska, the refusal to answer questions about civilian deaths, only made them deeper. The Alaska summit wasn't just about backroom deals and whispered negotiations. It was also about the one question that hung heavy in the air, a question the entire world was desperate to hear answered. As cameras rolled and microphones picked up the chaos, reporters shouted over one another. Mr. Putin, will you agree to a ceasefire? Will you commit to stop killing civilians? The room froze. All eyes locked on the Russian president. This was the moment, an opportunity to show even the slightest hint of humanity, a shred of compassion for the lives destroyed in Ukraine. But instead, Putin frowned, muttered coldly, "Let's go," and turned his head. Seconds later, the press was forced out of the room. No explanation. No denial. No reassurance. Just silence. It was the kind of silence that screamed louder than words. A silence that confirmed what many already feared. That civilian lives were not bargaining chips in this negotiation, but collateral damage in a game of power. And the fact that this silence played out on American soil, with Donald Trump standing just a few feet away, sent shockwaves through the global audience. Trump himself didn't step in. He didn't challenge Putin, didn't demand an answer. Instead, he let the silence hang, as if the question itself was too dangerous to touch. For many watching, that moment was more revealing than any official statement. Putin would not stop, and Trump would not push him. It was a chilling reminder that while politicians traded words in conference rooms, civilians in Ukraine continued to pay the ultimate price. So what does all of this actually mean? If you cut through the headlines, the smiles, and the vague promises, the reality is terrifying. Ukraine is being pushed into an impossible corner. If Kyiv accepts Putin's so-called deal, it would mean surrendering vast territories, regions filled with families who have already suffered under occupation, regions that make up the very heart of Ukraine's east. For Ukraine, that isn't peace. That's the slow erasure of their sovereignty, a forced rewriting of their national borders with blood and fear. But if Ukraine refuses, the war grinds on. More drones, more missiles, more funerals. Putin has made it clear. He won't stop the bombardment until his demands are met. And Trump, instead of calling out this blackmail, is positioning himself as the one man who can end the war. But only by giving Russia exactly what it wants. Europe, meanwhile, is caught in the middle. Do they stand by Ukraine and risk open conflict with Russia? Or do they follow Trump's lead and start pressuring Kyiv to give up land for the illusion of peace? The cracks in the alliance are growing, and Moscow is watching every fracture with satisfaction. In the end, Alaska wasn't just a meeting. It was a message. A message that the war in Ukraine is no longer just about territory. It's about trust, power, and survival. And the harsh truth is this. No matter what deal is signed, no one can say for certain whether Putin will stop, or whether this is just the beginning of something far darker. The Alaska summit will be remembered not for what was said, but for what was left unsaid. Putin never promised to stop the bombardment. Trump never challenged him. And Zelensky never got the ceasefire his people desperately needed. Instead, the world was left staring at a dangerous crossroads. One path leads to a so-called peace deal, where Ukraine sacrifices its land, its identity, and possibly its future, all in exchange for the fragile hope that Putin will keep his word. The other path leads to more bloodshed, more destruction, and a war with no end in sight. But here's the chilling part. Neither option guarantees peace. Because if history has taught us anything, it's that Vladimir Putin doesn't stop when you give him what he wants. He takes it as a green light to demand even more. And Trump's willingness to echo Russia's strength instead of Ukraine's struggle has left allies wondering. Whose side is America really on? For Europe, for NATO, for Ukraine itself, the message is clear. The fight is no longer just on the battlefield. It's in the negotiating rooms, the TV interviews, the whispered back channels where borders are redrawn without a single shot fired. And so the question remains, is this the beginning of peace, or the beginning of Ukraine's slow surrender? Will history remember Alaska as the moment the war ended, or as the moment the free world blinked? One thing is certain. The decisions made in those secret rooms will shape not only Ukraine's future, but the future of global power itself. And the world is watching, waiting, and wondering, when the next deal is made, who will pay the price?